This paper grows in large part out of the work that Bridget Murnahan and I, along with many others, have been doing on the reception of ancient Greek and Roman culture in children's literature. This project is broadly concerned both with children's encounters with the classical past, what they read or see or otherwise engage, and how they experience it, and with the constructions of and hopes for the child reader that govern the choices made by those adults who write, publish, illustrate, and buy books for children. A brief look at recent work on this topic reveals relatively little to do with Herodotus. In our own book, he makes no appearance, though I now, of course, see places where he might have, and elsewhere he tends to be cited only briefly and in passing, often as a source of material in one text or another. But scholars working to broaden our understanding of the reception of Herodotus, especially in the 19th century, have included work for children. You will recall Jordan Bailey's talk on the Helpline, From Children to Philosophers, Mapping and Measuring the Impact of Herodotus in the early 19th century. And children's encounters with Herodotus in a variety of contexts play an important role in papers by Edith Hall and Joseph Skinner, and Tom Harrison and Joseph Skinner's 2020 volume, Herodotus in the Long 19th Century. In this paper, which is definitely a work in progress and something of a prolegomenon, I begin by noting several different ways in which Herodotus has been a presence, though not necessarily named and not the center of attention in children's books. I then turn to a series of versions of Herodotus for children, exploring their self-presentation, the way they structure their narratives, and their use of illustration, and suggesting that in all three areas we find a recurrent tension between Herodotus as historian and Herodotus as storyteller. My examples take us from the middle of the 19th century to the present day. They are primarily Anglophone, but I will be looking at a French Herodotus for children towards the end. And I would be very happy to hear about retellings of Herodotus I've missed and retellings of Herodotus in different languages. I won't be discussing the important role of Herodotus in the early years of the study of ancient Greek, once a common childhood encounter for many boys with access to a privileged education and for the occasional girl. Ever since the pioneering work of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Charles Kingsley in the middle of the 19th century, children's first experience of the ancient world has often been through myths retold as children's stories. The myths most often chosen for retelling have several features. They are free of or easily freed from elements considered inappropriate for children. They may be tales of heroism. They often resemble fairy stories in their inclusion of magic, monsters, and transformation. They are frequently ideological, offering explanations of the natural world, and they may involve reward, punishment, and readily drawn morals. If they include children or characters who may be represented as children, so much the better. It isn't surprising then that a few of Herodotus' stories, and most notably the story of Arion, with its near magical music, helpful animal friend, and neatly tricked villains, have become a kind of honorary myth, showing up occasionally in anthologies of both classical and world mythology. Edith Hall, whose article, the article I mentioned, focuses on the reception of the Arion story in relation to Herodotus' perceived affinity with poetry, notes the story's appearance under the subheading Myth in an 1889 collection. Decades later, in Roger Lancelyn Green's 1958 anthology, Old Greek Fairy Tales, the story appears as The Boy and the Dolphin and starts in a typically fairy tale mode. There was once a minstrel boy in Greece whose name was Arion, and who could play upon the harp more sweetly than any man then living. The illustration shown here by Ernest Shepard, best known for his drawings in the Winnie the Pooh books, shows a distinctly boyish Arion confronting the villainous sailors with the dolphin listening in. And in the late 20th century, at a point when the cartoon is replacing the fairy tale as a child-friendly mode for retellings of myth, Marcia Williams tells and draws the story of Arion and the dolphin, plural here, in comic book style and colloquial language. Arion calls out, "Hello, fans," and prepares to return from Corinth, not just a star, but a megastar. Herodotus is, of course, a major source for many works of history intended for children, and some but not all of these acknowledge him either as a source or as a historical figure of note, or both, though he is rarely as fully used or acknowledged as in Dorothy Mills's 1925 Book of the Ancient Greeks, which includes the footnotes. Chapter 8 is taken chiefly from the history of Herodotus, and except where otherwise noted, chapter 9 is taken or adapted from the history of Herodotus. Mills's book, still in use decades later at the traditional girls' school where she herself had taught, must have been my own first introduction to Herodotus, but 11-year-olds aren't very attentive to footnotes, and I'm not sure I had any idea who I was reading. He is also the chief source for numerous works of historical fiction for children set during the Persian Wars. Many of these include fictional characters acting against the background of events described by Herodotus. In her 1932 collection, The Mule of the Parthenon, Ethel Parton includes several stories set during Xerxes' invasion. In one of these, entitled Dolphin Girl, a fisherman and his daughter contribute to the destruction of Persian ships in the storm off the coast of Magnesia by diving to cut their anchor ropes. In another, Purple and Gold, a Greek farmer faces ruin because the massive Persian army has trampled his crops and drained the river that is his source of irrigation. He is rescued by his daughter's discovery of a gold-tipped spear shaft in the riverbed. We find a more striking relationship to Herodotus in two early 20th century novels by Carolyn Dale Snedeker. These might be described as early variants of the now familiar genre Jeremy Rosen has called minor character elaboration, in which a story is retold to give a prominent voice and place to a character, often female, who was secondary or silenced in an earlier narrative, sometimes a less significant historical personage. In The Spartan, Snedeker tells the story of Aristodemus, who Herodotus tells us was blinded by eye disease at the time of the last stand at Thermopylae and escaped alive, only to be scorned by all other Spartans even after his brave death at the Battle of Plataea. Snedeker imagines him as the son of an Athenian father and a Spartan mother who returns to Sparta with her child after her husband's death. Aristodemus makes friends eventually in Sparta, learns to love and admire Leonidas, but never fully adjusts to the Spartan point of view and cannot accept the idea of a pointless and unreasoning end. In The Perilous Seat, Snedeker imagines the Pythia, who gives the oracle of the wooden walls, as a Delphian girl, desperate for expression and education, a natural poet no one will listen to. When, eager for a voice and eager for involvement in the great affairs of her day, she contrives to become Pythia. She is dismayed to find herself without Apollo's inspiration. She proceeds to compose the oracle herself on the basis of information let slip in her well-connected and anti-Persian father's house. And this is a somewhat long passage. I've put it on the handout as number 1 if you want to have a look at it. Snedeker includes Herodotus's account of Aristodemus as an appendix to her novel, but in her preface to The Perilous Seat, she says only that the background and details of this story have been carefully authenticated. She does, however, mention Herodotus at just one interesting point during her story, just before the Persians entering Delphi are scattered by an earthquake. What happened now can hardly be believed, but it is recorded by the father of history, and later writers bear testimony to it. This had happened time and again in the past to the herd of Delphi. Why not happen this once to her help? Herodotus says it did happen. It is almost as if Snedeker wants to make clear that she has not, like her heroine, presented her own invention as the truth the circumstances required, and calls on Herodotus, her own Apollo, in confirmation. Snedeker's admiration for Herodotus also leads her to introduce him as a sympathetic secondary character in a novel for somewhat younger children, Thyras and His Town. He appears towards the end of the book as Thyras' rescuer, a friend of his father, and, quote, the man who knew all the wonders of the world. He tells stories about Egypt, about kings and heroes, and about the Battle of Salamis. Who told you all these things? asked Theros wonderingly, for there were not books which told of these facts. Men in Egypt, men in Ionia, men in Persia, in Italy, and in the gardens of the Hesperides, answered Herodotus, but best of all, my own eyes looked and saw. But have you been so far to so many lands? Yes, child, and to many others. I never weary of this world in which we live. Snedeker's sympathetic depiction of Herodotus here seems to me to suggest some of the reasons why, in addition to the kinds of children's reading I have mentioned so far, we find from the middle of the 19th century to the present day, books whose central concern is to retell Herodotus for children. Adults imagine that Herodotus will appeal to children because he tells so many stories. He is also, in his all-embracing curiosity, both childlike and a model for children. Other reasons are not hard to find. Edith Hall notes that the historian could be considered, once mildly expurgated, as suitable for children and general audiences, and that his religiosity, albeit pagan, was another point in his favor. He is also readily seen as a suitable entry point in more than one way to the study of ancient history. Educators in the late 19th and early 20th centuries often recommend that children begin the study of ancient history with the stories Greek myth has to offer and go on to biography. Herodotus is a historian, many of whose stories are assimilable to myth and legend, and many of his characters, Solon, Lycurgus, Croesus, Cyrus, Leonidas, Themistocles, appear in recommended lists of biographies. The mixture of features that recommends Herodotus, when suitably edited or rewritten as a writer for children, means that such rewriting may respond to different desiderata and accordingly take somewhat different forms. There is a persistent tension in the history of children's literature between the merits of imaginative literature and of factual accounts. Traditional fairy tales, myth read as fairy tales, literary fairy tales, and other magic stories have been a staple of children's literature from its origins, but there have also been recurrent critiques of such literature, sometimes on religious grounds, sometimes influenced by a preference for the factual and rational in educational theories and theories of child development. We may thus find writers of ancient history for children seeking both to suggest that the stories they tell are as delightful as fairy tales, and that they have the advantage over fairy tales of being true. An ambivalence neatly summed up in titles like Jeanette Rector Hodgdon's The Enchanted Past, True Stories of the Lands Where Civilization Began. Children are expected both to take pleasure in these remarkable tales and to feel an additional pleasure in their factual truth. It isn't surprising then that versions of Herodotus for children reveal a certain ambivalence about what they are generically: stories for children or history, pleasure reading or education. An ambivalence generated both by debates about appropriate reading for children and by the nature of Herodotean narrative. And that this ambivalence is revealed in text, paratext, and illustration. So here are the books with which we're primarily going to be concerned. There appears at first to be a remarkable consistency in the books listed here. Book after book offers its readers stories, or in one case, tales from Herodotus, suggesting both a form of literature regularly offered to children and the common practice of selection for children from larger texts. The exceptions, those by John S. White and Gordon King, are also the only ones that represent themselves as edited by, rather than by, their retellers. If, however, we take a closer look at these stories and tales, we find that though all envision an audience of children, there is less agreement about whether this entails any significant generic transformation, resembling, for example, Nathaniel Hawthorne's rendering of myth as fairy tale. Charles Moberly's Stories from Herodotus declares in its preface that the following tales were written in part for the use of a class in the collegiate school at Liverpool. Their object is the presenting in a lively form the great facts of Grecian history so far as they tended toward the Persian Wars. So tales, yes, but history ultimately. The contents represent a similarly divided understanding of the enterprise. Moberly begins with two of the most folktale-like stories, Arion and the Treasure of Rhampsinitus, and even offers Polycrates and his ring in a ballad form, indebted to the recently published Lays of Ancient Rome. But among his other selections, few suggest stories rather than episodes in a continuous narrative. And even the ballad ends by dutifully pointing to the larger historical story, of which it is a part. But of the King Polycrates and all that him befell, if any list to hear the tale, another read shall tell. Alfred J. Church, a prolific reteller of ancient literature and writer of historical fiction, among his many works are Stories from Virgil, Stories from the Greek Tragedians, The Count of the Saxon Shore, The Burning of Rome, and so on, divides his 1881 version of Herodotus into two separate volumes with interestingly different titles: Stories of the East and The Story of the Persian War. Church expresses in the preface to The Story of the Persian War the hope that he may someday be able to publish Stories of the West, for which there was no room in this volume. But the impression given by the choice he has made is that stories are associated with the exotic and credulous East, whereas the West is the land of serious history. And this is apologetically reinforced by a remark which appears only in the preface to Stories of the East. I should be sorry that readers who are not acquainted with the work of the father of history should carry away from this book the impression that he is nothing more than a credulous and gossiping teller of stories, that he was often deceived and that he writes with a simplicity which is quite remote from our ways of thinking is manifest. But those who know him best are aware that he was nevertheless a shrewd and painstaking observer. In spite of these differences, however, both books proceed to narrate connected events in more or less the order of their original. Finally, in spite of the passage of more than a century, we can detect a similar tension in Lorna Oakes's 2016 Stories from Herodotus. As with contemporary retellings of myth, both physical form and cultural reference have shifted. This book is much shorter and thus thinner than its 19th century predecessors. It gives the impression, though this is misleading, of being a picture book, and it appeals to popular culture, in particular, the blockbuster movie 300, rather than to folktale or ballad. But if we look at the table of contents, we can see that this is essentially a very much condensed version of the histories for children. Our two editions of Herodotus, that is, the ones that present themselves as editions rather than retellings, also offer somewhat mixed messages. White sees himself as simply editing Herodotus history for boys and girls, omitting, quote, only what is indelicate to the modern ear or what the young reader might find tedious, redundant, or irrelevant to the main story. And his table of contents reflects this goal. But his preface, which I give in greater length on the handout, number 6, reveals a belief in the appeal of the fictional and biographical, telling its reader, imagine yourself in the city of Athens. During this year, a stranger from Halicarnassus has taken up his abode, and so on. And although he endorses the view that all the marvels in Herodotus are intended to prepare readers for the astounding victory of the Greeks over the Persians, he is finally overwhelmed by the charm of the storyteller, which he describes in a poetic fashion. Like the flowers of the magnolia tree, his bright stories and vivid descriptions at times almost overwhelm the root and branch of his narrative. Yet after all, we remember the magnolia more because of its cloud of snowy bloom in the few fleeting days of May than for all its green and shade in the other months. Gordon King's Herodotus emphasized the author's status as the first European historian, and its chapters, represented as chapters and not as stories, follow the main sequence of its original from King Croesus the Lydian through the final victory of the Greeks. But the context of publication complicates the nature of its appeal to its young readership. This book appeared in the Travel and Adventure Library for Young Folks whose covers include stereotypical depictions of various ethnic groups, in the company of titles such as Digging in Yucatan, Old Tales from Spain, Tales of a Russian Grandmother, Myself When Young, a Boy in Persia, Donegal Fairy Stories, Life of a North Greenland Eskimo Boy, California Fairy Tales, and Garam the Hunter, a Boy of the Hill Tribes. It seems quite clear that it is Herodotus' stories and ethnographic interests that have brought him here. And to this book, edited by a little-known writer of children's books who died young the following year, was assigned one of the most noted of the emigre illustrators who flourished in the US between the wars, Boris Artzybashev, known among other things for his work on children's books, folk tales, and a striking version of Aesop's fables. Our two remaining examples more fully live up to their titles, especially in the case of G.H. Bowden and W. Barrington D'Almeida's Wonder Stories from Herodotus. The authors, who unlike their 19th century predecessors were not schoolmasters but barristers, evidently doing some writing on the side, provide no preface and make no effort to link these tales with the larger narrative or purpose of the histories. Instead, we are given 6 stories full of the folktale or fairy elements that were generally supposed to appeal to children, including prophecy, trickery, marvels, reward and punishment, and important supporting roles for animals. Arion and the Dolphin, Ladronius, the Prince of Thieves, the Dream of Astyages, the Story of Croesus, the Conspiracy of the Magi, and the Story of Polycrates of Samos. And these stories, as well as making some predictable cuts, expand on their original in ways that suit their presumed fairy tale models, adding description, characterization, narrative detail, and dialogue, as well as touches of humor. This is the opening of Ladronius, the Prince of Thieves. You can find a longer excerpt as number 8 on the handout. Many hundred years ago, not long after the Greeks returned from the famous city of Troy, there lived a king of Egypt whose name was Rhampsinitus. So great a king was he that he kept a small army constantly employed in supplying the royal household with goods. And another small army was required to keep the gardens of the palace in order. And had anyone been bold enough to doubt the greatness of the king, he need only to have looked at his magnificent dress to set all doubts at rest forever. I should add, and we will return to this shortly, that this is the first of our versions to be accompanied by the kind of illustration generally associated with storybooks and other books for children. Our final collection seems to me to have an equal claim to being a collection of tales for children, but it presents us with a mystery I'm hoping someone on the helpline can help me solve. If Bowden and D'Almeida don't fit the profile of their predecessors, the author of this last collection, the 2020 Tales from Herodotus for Young Readers, has no profile at all, nor does the mysterious Ars Longa Press. My department's ever resourceful research librarian, Margaret Schaus, who tracked down Bowden and D'Almeida, located a review of their book and found Gordon King's obituary, couldn't find a trace of this author, whom I will therefore call anonymous. The book was likely published on demand. It has no illustrations, and the preface includes only a brief account of Herodotus' life. The stories include many of the usual: Arion, the thief, the ring of Polycrates, and as also with many recent retellings of myth, the titles are on the jokey side. Off with their ears, Tall Tales and Girl, A Nose for Conquest, Rolling Seas and Heads. And although some of these stories are connected, and we glimpse a little more historical sequence than in Bowden and D'Almeida's version, the author works to make the story self-contained and to address his young readers in a personal voice. The story of the Pharaoh and the thief begins, of all rulers, there are none so wealthy as the pharaohs in Egypt, and of all the Egyptian pharaohs, the wealthiest was King Rhampsinitus. This king, being so very rich, made many great buildings and monuments. It is even said that he was named Rhampsinitus because there were so many ramps in his pyramid, as though a man could be named at birth for a pyramid that wasn't finished until after his death. So that is a very foolish story. But here is one that might not be, if only you follow it closely. It has a great many parts. The end of this is on the handout. At this point, I will offer a few more comments on textual narrative in these works before turning to illustration. As we have already seen, the choice of stories or sections of Herodotus is fairly consistent from the 19th through the early 21st century. Among the episodes that recur most regularly are the stories of Arion, the two thieves, Croesus and Cyrus, the ring of Polycrates, Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. Where other material is concerned, the customs of Egypt are far more likely to be included than any other ethnographic accounts. The stylistic archaism characteristic of most translation and much retelling from the 19th through the early 20th centuries persists in our texts as late as Gordon King's 1929 version, where Croesus, for example, asked Solon, "Stranger of Athens, is my happiness then so held at naught by thee?" But the 21st century books are written in contemporary, though not particularly colloquial prose, and sometimes adopt a conversational style. These recent books also seem to expect a somewhat younger audience, although it can be difficult to draw comparisons in this respect between different periods. We have different expectations for what children will read. The regular practice of expurgation in translations and retellings for both children and general audiences through the middle of the 19th century means that in our earlier texts, sexual and scatological details are omitted or treated euphemistically, usually without any notice of the omission. White is the only one of our authors who actually states that he will avoid what would be indelicate to modern ears. So, for example, he reduces the story of Gyges and Candaules to a single sentence. Candaules was murdered by his favorite, Gyges. Skips over Pisistratus' unconventional relations with Megacles' daughter, Astyages' first dream about Mandane, and Hippias' dream about his mother, and leaves all sexual customs out of the ethnographies. As we would suppose, these omissions may be found in our other retellings as well, but there are some interesting variations and shifts. I offer two examples: Astyages' first dream about Mandane, and the trick by which Darius gains the kingship. Moberly omits the story of Cyrus's birth, and with it the dream. Church offers a vague account. Astyages, king of the Medes, had a daughter whose name was Mandane, and of this daughter, when she was but a child, he dreamed such a dream that he feared exceedingly what might happen to him and to his kingdom by reason of her. And I continually envision a child saying, "What was the dream? What was the dream?" White skips the first dream and gives a modified version of the second. Bowden and D'Almeida, who entitled his story "The Dream of Astyages," give an extensive and wonderfully dreamlike account in which a river overflows the city, and the baffled Astyages is told that the name of the river is Mandane. He nearly drowns and wakes in great alarm. And I particularly like the dreamlike element. The people who were standing by him did not seem in the least surprised. King gives a condensed and misleading story of Cyrus' origins, which makes the dreams unnecessary. As for our most recent authors, in an era in which children's books are more comfortable with at least some bodily functions, Oakes and Anonymous include both dreams, but the language in which they describe the first dream suggests some residual discomfort. Anonymous is uncharacteristically formal, and Oakes, oddly, first uses an old-fashioned euphemism and then explains it in colloquial terms, likely to be much more familiar to her readers. Next, in Herodotus' account of Darius' ascent to the kingship, the groom Oibares arranges to have Darius' stallion mate with his favorite mare the night before, in the place where the 7 contenders are to meet. The association then causes him to neigh at the desired time. Herodotus also offers another version in which the groom touches the mare's genitals and then touches the horse's nose. Needless to say, this story is variously obscured. Moberly again omits the whole story, collapsing the conspirators' vote for monarchy into a vote for Darius. Church and White go in for vagueness. The groom has an unspecified device or trick that will make a horse neigh. Again, you have to wonder about children's questions. Bowden and D'Almeida, who are always interested in making a good story, provide a plausible alternative. The groom makes sure the horse isn't fed and appears at sunrise with a bag of grain, with predictable results. And this choice, by the way, nicely reflects the historical role of food in children's literature as an acceptable form of sensuality. In 1929, when restrictions are just beginning to loosen up a bit, King tells the story pretty much as Herodotus does, except that the language was particularly fond, suggests an amiable friendship between the two animals, and the groom does not actually let the stallion mount the mare. Neither of our 20th century versions tells the story at all. If omissions are common throughout our retellings, they are more inventively handled by some than others. And it is the writers like Bowden, D'Almeida, and Anonymous, who most notably rewriting Herodotus with children's amusement and children's questions in mind, that are most likely to invent and include details they feel children might want to have. I will cite just two brief examples, both from the story of Croesus. Bowden and D'Almeida's retelling is in general ameliorative, but most interestingly so in its final detail. Moreover, he discovered a new treasure in his neglected son, who was always with him to share his troubles and watch over him in his old age. Anonymous, who tells the story of Cleobus and Biton as a freestanding tale, in which it is the narrator who asks the question, who is or has been the most fortunate of all, makes two interesting changes. Their mother went home alone on foot and full of sorrow, but it is clear that the gods had struck the young man down in answer to her prayer, for she had prayed that they should always be so praised as they were on that day. By changing the nature of the mother's request, the author here avoids puzzling children by suggesting that death is in a general sense the best for humans. At the same time, they are reassured in a single sentence, moving in its simplicity and in the telling detail, on foot, that their mother loves and will miss them. I turn now to illustration, once common in books for both adults and children, but long identified especially with the latter, and a feature that, as Bridget and I found in our work on myth collections, plays an especially strong role in people's memories of childhood reading, along with other features of the physical book like color and size. In our work on anthologies of myth for young readers, we found several trends in illustration. In the late 19th and early 20th century, such collections were regularly illustrated by noted artists and illustrators, Walter Crane, Frederick Church, Arthur Rackham, H.M. Brock. This was especially the case when a book was destined for the all-important Christmas gift book market on which publishers depended. The work of these illustrators, though never transgressing accepted constraints on what children should see, rarely seems directed at a child viewer in any way we would recognize now, but it was compatible with the kind of art children would have seen in other illustrated books. The first half of the 20th century saw contributions in the US from notable émigré artists like Billy Pogani and Boris Artzybashev, and the beginnings of illustrations that seem more child-directed. From the mid-century on, the picture book or lavishly illustrated book becomes standard, with images increasingly playful and cartoon-like now interspersed throughout the text rather than framed on facing pages, and offering a visual narrative that reflects, supplements, and occasionally subverts the textual one. I found a rather different pattern here, and one that reflects the tension between the storybook Herodotus and the historian Herodotus. Of our 19th century versions, only Bowden and D'Almeida's Wonder Stories has the kind of illustration familiar in myth books and adventure stories. Moberly has only a frontispiece and a few vignettes. Expense may have been a consideration, since he notes the importance of maps, only to assure our young readers that good maps of ancient Greece and Asia may be had separately and very cheap. White's title page mentions 50 illustrations, but none of these are actually illustrations in the usual sense. They are taken either from ancient works of art or from etchings of 19th century landscapes, oddly for this purpose, populated by people in modern dress, and thus offer the child reader a view distanced either by time or by space or both. So again, a little, and we get animals. We always get animals. Spearing the crocodile and so forth. Church follows a similar practice, offering illustrations from ancient frescoes and sculptures, but there is a difference. These have been adapted by the illustrator E.L. Seeley, a relative of Church's, who replaced black and white images with a warmer color, and one, at least in the Persian Wars volume, intended to recall the coloring of a certain small class of Greek pottery. The ones I have here are all taken from the Stories of the East. And I apologize for only being able to show you details in color. This has to do with how I was able to get hold of this volume. These were noted by a reviewer in the Academy who praises the way Church has, quote, emphasized Herodotus' charm as a storyteller without losing sight of his merits as a historian, and adds that Miss E.L. Seeley, the illustrator, deserves similar praise for the daring manner in which she has restored the pictures of the monuments by touches of color and shading. It is clear that the reviewer saw this book as an appropriate offering for the annual gift book market, since he concludes by saying that although he prefers Church's selections from more literary texts, quote, we treasure Professor Church's new volume so highly that the boy for whom it is destined shall not see it until the holidays are well begun. But even if Seeley's efforts put Church's book on a par with other illustrated volumes, the images here, as in white, bear only a limited relation to the narrative they accompany. Again, they're more illustrating background than they are illustrating narrative. Bowden and Dalmaida's Wonder Stories from Herodotus is another gift book and is illustrated in a way more typical of such volumes by H. Granville Fell. Both title and illustrations clearly place this book in the story rather than the history camp. A reviewer in the Academy's Christmas edition writes, other collections of fairy or magical stories are Fairy Tales from Afar, a translation from the Danish of Grundtvig, and Wonder Stories from Herodotus by Messrs. G.H. Bowden and W.B. Dalmaida, in which, perhaps for the first time, children may learn the moving histories of Croesus and Astyages, Adronius, and Polycrates. To serve up Herodotus thus was a happy thought. Mr. Granville Fell's illustrations lack sympathy but are decoratively effective. That, however, is not what the nursery wants. If the tone here sounds a bit jaundiced, have a look at the reviewer's comment on the whole business of Christmas book reviewing. He writes, piled in great heaps on our office table, these books laugh at our efforts to deal with them. Granville Fell provides a small vignette and two framed and titled color illustrations for each story. The choices, whether his, the authors, or the publishers, seem fairly predictable, and he doesn't shy away from gore. Here are the three for Ladronius, Prince of Thebes. And here is one for the story of Croesus and one for the ring of Polycrates, about which, if there's time, more later. Although Gordon King's Herodotus presents itself as history, both its context of publication and its illustrations, as I noted above, suggest its literary and folkloric associations. Boris Artzybashev was born in Kharkiv and emigrated in 1919 to New York City, where he became a well-known illustrator and magazine artist. A few years later, he edited and illustrated a stunning edition of Aesop's Fables. And it is hard not to imagine that a particular interest in animals partially governed his highly unpredictable choices in illustrating Herodotus. You start fairly predictable, but then more animals, lots of animals. I think this is a very curious choice for an illustrator in a way, but an interesting one. There is, in addition, in his work, a comedic element, sometimes involving gender and ethnic stereotyping of a now uncomfortable sort, and a tendency not uncommon in children's books to, as it were, wink at the adult reader. Helen of Troy. A very curious choice for Artemisia, who is clearly not being admired for her bravery, but for something quite else. I suspect he was prevailed on to include a standard map, but insisted on providing this one. Alas, retellings of Herodotus lack the popularity of retellings of myth, and our two most recent versions in the US and UK were cheaply published. Only Oakes is illustrated, and the illustrations are, with one arresting exception, emblems of stories rather than depictions of moments in the narrative. There is, however, as I discovered when I was well embarked on this project, a richly illustrated French edition of Herodotus, published in 2019, adapted by Laurent Bègue with the participation of others and aimed at children, although the back cover offers a warning about violence for those under 10. This edition presents itself as an adaptation edition, like White's or King's, rather than a retelling, and the table of contents, like White's, goes through the histories book by book. Such editions, as I have noted, are mostly educational, little boxes with background information, but the ambiguity of the French histoire may perhaps allow the title to suggest both Herodotus the historian and Herodotus the storyteller. The book begins with an allusion to a sonnet by Du Bellay and ends with Victor Hugo's poem, The 300, and the preface describes the book as a kind of transition from myth to history. The language at the end, tout imagé et coloré de magie. I see a misspelling there, sorry. Although descriptive of text, seems to call for illustration. And this book is illustrated not by images from ancient art, but by full color images interspersed with text that assist in telling the story, while maps remind us that this is also history. So here are some examples. You can see that they are not shying away from telling stories that we haven't seen much of elsewhere, Gyges and Candaules, for example. Gore in the form of the head of Cyrus drinking blood. Animals with an informative inside box. And we also get the sort of magical, both sort of ethnographical and magical elements. This is the performance of the sack of Miletus, with the Athenians all very upset about it at Marathon. The dream, the whipping, Thermopylae, Salamis. I should say that this scene, the scene of Xerxes seated looking down at the Battle of Salamis, is a favorite and shows up in a lot of the history books that I had a look at too. Informational maps every now and then. Okay, that's there. What I'm going to do now is compare the treatment of a few scenes that are chosen by more than one of our illustrators. And these are things that you might well want to comment on or think about also. Then I'll go on to a very brief coda. So the first scene is Croesus on the pyre. So here we have E.L. Seeley's illustration for Church's Stories of the East and Boris Artzybashev's illustration for Gordon King's Herodotus. Both illustrators have obviously modeled their images on the well-known red figure vase in the Louvre, but quite differently. Seeley's brief was clearly to reproduce in an appealing way ancient works of art that would evoke for children the historical period and cultural context of the events related by Herodotus. And here, as everywhere else, she follows her model very closely. This scene is unusual among her illustrations in actually depicting a moment in the narration, rather than some phenomenon more loosely related to the text. But the details of the illustration don't correspond to the details in Herodotus's text. Where are the 14 Lydian boys? Where are the chains? And the vase painting on which it is based very likely represents a different version of the story. Artzybashev has also incorporated the main elements of the vase painting, but rather than simply labeling his illustration, Artzybashev has followed the tradition in which an illustrator accompanies his image either in its frame or, as here on the facing page, with a line from the text that clarifies what is called the moment of choice. And here that line points not to an action or a scenario, but to a state of mind. Artzybashev's Croesus is indeed sadly musing, in contrast with the happily smiling person lighting the fire, who seems likely to be a pleased Persian. I am not sure what to make of the little snake that we see down by his foot. Maybe some of you will have ideas. Attis Adrastus on the boar. Granville Fell's depiction of this scene, as often in books of this period, comes several pages before the event, which is recounted by Bowden and D'Almeida in much more detail than we find in Herodotus. I think I give this in the handout. and one that makes, including a much more detailed account of how it is that Adrastus kills Attis, and one that makes Adrastus more praiseworthy. He isn't simply trying to kill the boar with the other hunters, he is trying to save Attis. The boar made one of his fiercest rushes in the direction of Attis, who threw his spear and missed, and Adrastus, seeing the prince in danger and mindful of the king's charge, threw his spear. But just as the weapon left his hand, Attis sprang away from the boar right into the path of the spear, which struck him between his shoulders and laid him senseless on the ground. Granville Fell's caption gives none of this away in advance, but he is clearly working to represent the story as it is told in the text. We can see Attis on the left, the boar rushing towards him, and Attis getting ready to throw the ill-fated spear. Lassie's illustration, more contemporary and being inserted in the text rather than separately framed, depicts a similar moment in the narrative, but is selective in showing us not the circle of hunters Herodotus describes, but the two on whom our attention is focused. And Oak simply gives us the boar. That's a detail from the Granville Fell version. The story of Polycrates. Although most of our retellers include in this story Polycrates' horrible end, variously described, it isn't surprising that no one chooses to illustrate it, and that instead illustrators focus on the folktale-like account of the ring and the fish. Antonova is again emblematic rather than narrative. Granville Fell offers, as always, a fully framed scene set off with a title, and Lassie gives what might once have been called a vignette, unframed and without complete background. The moment of choice is interesting. Granville Fell's version includes the main players in the story, Polycrates, the fisherman, and a large fish itself. Lassie has decided to show instead the moment of discovery described by Herodotus. It is, of course, the servants responsible for preparing the fish who find the ring. I was struck by this because I realized I had always remembered Polycrates as finding the ring himself. And I conclude with the horse of Darius, whom we've already talked about in connection with expurgation. This moment is perhaps irresistible for an illustrator who wants to show a grand equestrian moment. And these two versions, a century apart, bear a very close resemblance to each other. This one is from Granville Fell, this is from the French version. But there are some interesting differences. Granville Fell's Darius looks like a figure from the past, but it has the same fuzzy historicity as the Arcadian language of the text. Darius could be a figure from the European Middle Ages, and the drawing of the sword seems inappropriate to the moment. I keep expecting a caption that says something like "off to the Crusades" or words to that effect. The other nobles are nowhere to be seen, but the clever servant is here, carrying the bag of corn the authors have inserted into the text in place of the mayor. The other illustration sticks very closely to the text, with the same apparent attention to historicity of costume we think is being tried for elsewhere. Now, in contrast with these two, oh dear, I've lost my other illustration. Ah, this is terrible. Hold on a second. I'll have to take a brief excursion. No, whoops. Well, you'll just have to take my word for it. I'll try to find it later on, maybe during the question period. Artsy Bashev has a hilarious little illustration showing the moment when the two horses are together, and has, in keeping with the general tendency, for example, in the Disney studios, how do you show that an animal is female, given the mare long eyelashes and a pronounced blush on her cheeks? If I can find it, I must have accidentally deleted it, but I may be able to find it later on. So he doesn't do the moment of Darius's victory, but the trick that leads up to it. And again, it is really a jokey one aimed, I think, more at adults than with children. So coming to my conclusion and a coda, I hope I've been able to bring out some of the most striking features of the reception of Herodotus for children and a particular ambivalence in them. There's a lot more that could be said, and I'll be happy to pursue any avenues in the discussion. I concluded the brief coda asking, where else is this going and where else might it go? I had originally hoped to include Jean Bendick's 2016 book, Herodotus on the Road to History, but there clearly wasn't time. This book, instead of retelling Herodotus, offers us an imagined life of the historian for children. Bendick is not the first to do this. She has, for example, a notable 19th century predecessor in J.T. Wheeler's The Life and Travels of Herodotus in the 5th century before Christ, an imaginary biography based on fact. Got to get both of those in again. The two are very different. Wheeler is, I think, aiming at the general reader, Bendick specifically at youngish children. Wheeler's is a massive 2-volume novel, and at 79 pages, Bendick's fits standard publishers' limits for children's publications. They do have one interesting thing in common. Both of them bring Herodotus' story into contact with biblical history, something not at all unusual in the 19th century, but in the present day, very likely a reflection of the Christian press that published Bendick's book and of the general affinity of the Christian homeschooling community for ancient literature. We owe reprints of Church's books and many others to a similar publishing enterprise. Some of you probably already know about this, but I just discovered the Story Nori version of Herodotus online last week. So we'll probably perhaps see more of the same. And finally, given the prominence of animals in illustrated children's versions of Herodotus, the prominence of animals in children's literature, and the attraction many readers feel to the Herodotus they meet with in his text, we should perhaps not be surprised to find him in this incarnation, which some of you may have encountered, a French children's picture book, which also appears in English translation. Herodotus is a young hedgehog, curious about everything. What next? Well, I would like to know who Anonymous is. And I also think there's room for a really fine illustrated book of stories of Herodotus for the 21st century. I'm hoping that might come along. So thank you very much.